Hi guys, this is Mrs. Powers, and I am bringing you your history lesson this week. Today we are going to do lesson 39, and I know because of our schedule this week, things may look a little different in history. I know we're in lesson 39, and then I think they'll go backwards at school to 38 and may come back to 37. So just know they're kind of a little bit out of order just because of our schedule differences this week. But today we're in lesson 39, okay? And then we will look, after we read it, we'll look at pre-test number 13, the last two questions there, okay? So let's get started. All right, the invasion of the Vikings, lesson 39. God, deliver us from the fury of the Northmen. This was the literal prayer of countless souls in Europe during the fearsome age of the Vikings. The Vikings, also called Northmen or Norsemen, were savage raiders who plundered and destroyed endless numbers of villages across Europe for about 300 years. Why were the Vikings so cruel? To them, it was in part a matter of survival. The Vikings were people who originally lived on the coast of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These are also called the Scandinavian countries. The term Viking probably comes from the Norse word vik, which means inlet or bay. It describes the watery coast where most of the Vikings lived. If you were to look on a map, you would see how close together the Scandinavian countries are. You will also notice how far north they are. It is both the location and the terrain of these countries that contributed to the desperation of the Vikings. You see, each of these countries has certain difficulties when it comes to farming. Norway is a glistening land of hills, snow-covered mountains, and fjords. A fjord is a valley of water with steep hills on either side. Though breathtaking, this terrain doesn't offer much open space for crops. Sweden, on the other hand, has fewer mountains and more farmland, but sometimes weeks can go by without the sun shining there. Because of how the earth tilts on its axis, the sun hides during some seasons in the far North Pole regions. Without year-round sunshine, farming is obviously a challenge. Denmark, which is further south than Sweden, has exposure to the sun every day of the year, but much of the country is made up of tiny islands. 500 tiny islands, that is. So, like Norway and Sweden, Denmark too is a tough place for farming. Are you beginning to see the pattern here? As people grew in numbers in Scandinavia, they became hungry and desperate for more farmland and ways to support their families. And desperation, apart from the Lord, can lead to cruel measures. Hopefully, this sheds some understanding on the beginning of the Viking reign of terror. So what did the Vikings do to try to survive? Well, first they built great ships so they could travel away from their lands and raid new ones. In fact, the Vikings built the best ships known in the Mediterranean world. These masterful ships, built 100 feet long, were sturdy, maneuverable, and made with layers of flexible wood. The flexible layers prevented harsh ocean waves from breaking up the boats at sea. Then, with these reliable vessels, the Vikings set out to capture, pillage, and plunder just about anything and everything they could find. They would sneak into a port, hide their boats, and pounce on their victims before anyone knew what was happening. The most profitable targets were the numerous monasteries that dotted the shores of Europe. The first documented raid of this kind was in 793 on Lindisfarne in a small island off England. In 802, the Vikings hit the church of St. Columba on a Scottish island. Remember St. Columba? Monasteries like these were usually well stocked with provisions and lightly guarded by monks and nuns. Without concern for these peaceful people, the Vikings stole their goods and burned down their dwellings. There was little mercy given to the victims. Many were killed and taken as slaves. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes it this way. They lay waste everything in sight. They trample the holy relics underfoot. They seize the treasure of the holy church. Some of the monks they kill outright. Others they carry away with them. A great many they insult and beat and fling out naked. Others they drown in the sea. They depart, boasting about their plunder and their wicked deeds. Though these ruthless Vikings Viking warriors are often depicted with animal horns on their helmets, there is not much evidence that these were actually worn by the Vikings. However, it was common for Viking warriors to have helmets of leather or iron that covered the nose. Wealthy warriors had tiny rings of iron made into armor or chainmail. Less wealthy soldiers had only thick leather coverings. Vikings' weapons included long swords, battle axes for cutting through their enemies' helmets, and a single-edged knife called a scramasac. These were used for hand-to-hand combat. Unfortunately for their victims, this up-close combat was the most common and bloody method of fighting the Vikings used. They were rather fearless. Some Viking warriors patterned themselves after legendary heroes called the Jomsvikings and the Berserks. The Jomsvikings were so fearfully rugged and masculine that they refused to keep women in their homes. The Berserks were even more savage. For battle, they dressed in animal skins, if they wore any clothing at all. Then they worked themselves into a wild rage and howled like animals. The term going berserk comes from these crazed Vikings. For centuries, Viking raiders viciously attacked the coastlands of Europe. Viking men would pillage across the seas for a season and then travel home to their families in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. When their supplies ran low, the raids would start all over again. But over time, this kind of plundering wasn't enough to support Viking families. They needed new lands to settle, and so the Vikings spread throughout Europe, conquering as they went. The Swedish Vikings traveled to and conquered the land of present-day Russia. They eventually made Kiev their capital city. They were known there as the Varangians. In fact, the name Russia probably comes from a Varangian tribe named as the Rus or Rus. It may have described people with red hair, a common trait of these Vikings. The Varangians were such good soldiers that some were recruited to be the personal bodyguards of the king of the Byzantine Empire. The Danish Vikings sought to conquer parts of England, France, and Spain. In England, they successfully ruled an area called York. They kept it a stronghold for roughly 300 years. In France, the Danish Vikings sailed inland along the Seine River to reach and destroy Paris. They sacked it 3 times, in 845, 856, and 885. Finally, the king paid them large sums of money in the form of Danengeld to leave. It worked, too. In fact, the payment of Danengeld became a common method of taming down savage Viking attacks. The Danish Vikings later settled a province named Normandy along the northern coast of France. In 911, the king of the West Franks agreed to give them the strip of land to bring some sort of peace to his country. He appointed a Viking named Rollo to be the Duke of Normandy. Interestingly, Rollo converted to Christianity near this time. In doing so, he pledged to keep peace with France, and he did. By the way, Normandy is the location of the famous beach that the Allies invaded in World War II to drive back the Germans. It was also the home of William the Conqueror, who we will study later. Lots of history comes from this Viking settlement. The third group of Vikings, the Norwegian Vikings, headed in yet another direction. They settled places like Greenland, Iceland, Scotland, and Ireland. In fact, Dublin, the present-day capital of the Republic of Ireland, was originally a Viking town. The Norwegian Vikings also went exploring as far as North America. They called it Vinland, but that's such a good story I'm saving it for a later lesson. In closing, you are probably thinking that the Vikings were pretty terrible people, and from the way they raided the conquered villages of unprotected, innocent people, they were. But there is, of course, another side to the Scandinavian people. There is the side of them that cared for their families, their homes, and their faith. We'll look at this domestic side of the Vikings in our next lesson. Among their own people, the Vikings weren't nearly so dreadful as their enemies believed them to be. In fact, back in their homelands, the Vikings weren't all that different from the Europeans who prayed, "Deliver us from the Northmen." All right, that's the end of lesson 39. We'll take a look at pre-test number 13. So you can get it out now, or you can just listen and fill it in later. But pre-test number 13, if you look at question number 7 and number 8, those are the two we're going to answer. Number 7 says the countries of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. So let's look down. Oh, it's kind of like Jeopardy style. So what's the question for that answer? What is Scandinavia? So those are the Scandinavian countries, right? The name of a Viking combat knife. So that one would be, what is a scramasax? I guess that's how you say it. I don't know. I'm not very good with languages. I'm sorry, guys. Scramasax. So that's the answer to number 8. So there are only 2 questions for pretest 13, and then we'll, as we do the other lessons this week, you'll fill in the rest of pretest 13. Hope you guys have a great week. Enjoy your Monday at school or at home doing school. And I will see you next week, guys. Have a great week.